Welcome to the Injection Connection, in-depth discussions with thought leaders and professionals in the polyurethane infrastructure repair industry.
Welcome to the latest and well overdue episode of the Injection Connection. I've got Murray Heywood with me, and he's the first person, not that we have a giant repertoire of guests, but he's our first drummer that's on this. And let's see, what you started your band, what, like in 82?
The band has been together off and on, since 1982. Yeah.
That's it. It started as a punk band, right?
Yes, and we still have those leanings. I mean, punk now is a bit, we're not like in today's punk world, we're pretty mild.
Sure.
We're more like the Ramones than we are like the, Black Flag or something like that.
Yeah. Whoever thought back like in 82 or back then when we were doing all this stuff that we'd be old people being, in that scene. So yeah, that's funny. But anyway, I derailed it completely with that. Murray also, besides being a drummer, has a long history in coatings and paintings. And I guess you've worked for Sherwin-Williams. You're currently at Corrosion Probe Incorporated.
Yep.
And you were at Sherwin-Williams twice, correct?
Yes. I've been in the industry now my entire life. I grew up in the paint. My father was a paint contractor, and so I started at a really young age. I mean, I say 40 years, but in reality, it's actually longer than that. But I think for labor laws, I can't mention that I was working at like 12 and 13 with my dad, but he's long gone, so they can't get him.
Right.
But yeah, so it's been a long time. And I started off as an applicator, and then I worked for DeVoe Coatings for a couple times, and then Sherwin-Williams for a couple times. And then I was on my own for a while. And so I've kind of bounced around, and now I've landed at Corrosion Probe, which I'm very happy to be sort of the last leg of my career, I guess, if you could say, for lack of a better term.
Excellent. Yeah. And Murray's time when I met him, he was working at Sherwin-Williams. I was working at Avanti. And he then moved up to the wastewater market manager for North America. So he was, and that was a new division that was started up to, I guess, so Sherwin-Williams could get into manhole work.
Well, just I think it was more just because Sherwin-Williams realized that if you're too if you're not focused, right? If your reps are just selling whatever they can sell, there's no focus. They always go for the low hanging fruit, right? Which is not the water and wastewater industry, as you know, is a tough process because it's all spec driven and standards driven. You can't just sell whatever you want, or they can't just use whatever they want. There's a whole process. So it needs focus. So they brought in that division to really laser focus on it, is what they did.
Yeah, and it seems to be doing really, really well with that. And anyway, so that's how I was introduced. We met, and we did a number of trainings together and all that. I always like to say the biggest competitor that we see as a manufacturer, but just in grouting at all, because I've been 3 manufacturers, and I've said this the whole time, it's ignorance. People in different industries don't understand, and grouting's always ancillary to an industry. I typically don't find a grouter who's just that's all they're doing. They're doing coatings, they're doing something else. So in this case, coatings that have led us together there.
Well, even from an educational standpoint, when you say grout, it's like people, if they don't know what you're talking about, what are you talking about? My tiles? Or are you talking about, because then there's grouts that we epoxy grouts and cementitious grouts that we use to build up surfaces and level. It's a very broad term. So when you say grout, they don't necessarily know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and so just to prove that I am the Grout Geek. It's like was it the 1500s? Grout was actually porridge. Porridge, when it sat for a while, got hard.
Yes.
And that's the whole concept of grout. Grout's basically some type of a liquid or kind of slurry type mix that just sets up and hardens. but
Right.
there's all different types of properties. I was on the ICRI committee for a couple of years. This was back in the 2000s. And we couldn't even define grout. We could not come down to an agreement when everybody agreed on what grout was, because we did. We had epoxy guys and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, and it's because I think we've had a lot of focus in this world in the last 20. Everything gets a lot sharper. 100 years ago, Olympic athletes used to train for a couple months and go to the Olympics. Now it's a lifetime career, and we have lifetime focused people. And so it's the same thing now, where you're finding companies focus and they try to find an exact way they're going to do things. But grouting never falls into an exact way. It's always such a big mess. So no one really wants to. I guess that's why there's no giant industry behind it. So that's why there's people like me. I'm on this giant catfish in this little bitty pond of grouting, which is like 1% of all grouting is the chemical grouting. So it's a real tiny industry.
Yeah, I know, but it's interesting because even when it comes to the protective coating side of things, when people don't understand it, including some engineers and whatnot, they just don't necessarily understand all the concepts, and when people find out what I do for a living, they kind of scratch their head and goes, that's a thing.
Yep. And then the next question after that is like, so is that brand new? And you're like, do I look brand new? And it's older than me, so no. I mean,
well, it's funny. What's funny, when I'm at the border crossing over, and they go, "Well, what do you do exactly?" I go, "I'm a coding specialist." And they go, "Like computer code?" I went, "No,
right.
coating,
Yes.
paint."
Yep.
And they look at you and they scrunch up their face and they go, "There's paint specialists? Like that's a thing?" It's like,
every time autocorrect sees grouting, they want to change it to like grouping or meeting or something. They don't want to use the word grouting at all, probably, right? So we've talked about kind of how you got into the industry. What are some of, from your point of view, when it comes to grouting, what are some of the common mistakes or problems you see that people just deal with repeatedly?
Well, I mean, when it comes to, like, in my world, in the coatings world, one of our biggest challenges is water, right? Keeping it where you want it, or not keeping it, not letting it get in where you don't want it. And that water molecule creates a lot of damage, and concrete, which is predominantly the work that we do in the infrastructure world, like 85% of water and wastewater structures are concrete, and concrete has very poor elongation properties, doesn't stretch very well, but it does move a lot because of settlement and this and that, and inflection when you're loading tanks, unloading. So you get cracks, and you have to stop. And if we don't address the water coming in or whatnot, it creates even bigger issues. So grout plays a huge role in doing that. And I mean, I think one of the challenges that I see is people don't understand that you just can't fill it with some cement, and because if it cracks again, it's going to leak again. You just can't fill it with an epoxy injection, because that's rigid and it's not, so there's just the misconception of how to deal with it is prevalent, and it's something that we try to explain a lot. And just mistakes are made where we're just going to put hydraulic cement in and fix it that way, or we're going to do this, or the coating should handle it, and we shouldn't have to do this extra work. And so I just see the mistakes in the materials they select to do the repairs, and not understanding necessarily that it has to be treated, or it's going to, you're just spending thousands and thousands of dollars to rehab this, and you're going to skip that part that's going to wreak havoc on your system, right? So those are the common mistakes. It's a lack of understanding, really, when you get to the bottom of it, of how it all works together.
Yeah, and I guess what always I find interesting about that, because I mean, neither one of us are engineers that have gone and gotten those type of degrees and stuff like that. So we're not always the smartest person in the room. Typically, I'm nowhere even close to that.
But I may not be the smartest person in this room right here.
There you go. I'll give you that one. How's that? I'll take that. Thank you. really what you find, it's not that this industry, it's not that it's rocket science or hard to figure out. It's that it's non-intuitive, and most of the time it's people just overlook it. They don't even understand that it's something. So again, it's not a fear thing of, oh, you're just never going to figure this out and be able to launch a rocket to Mars. It comes down to people just make common mistakes with it. Like you mentioned with the epoxy, there's no elongation or very little elongation for concrete at all. And you'll have people, they waterproof epoxies all the time, and then they get a mirror crack right by it, and they're like, whoa, didn't we just fix this last year? And you're like, there it is.
Yeah.
It's just it's ignorant. They don't understand it and don't look at it because it's that small section of a market, I think.
Yeah, and there's also a certain amount of where it's an afterthought. It's not part of the original plan. They don't look at it. They don't consider it. They think that the coating is going to solve all these problems, or the lining is going to solve all these problems, and they overlook it and don't realize just how damaging. Like, I mean, depending where you are in the country or in North America, where I reside, things freeze and a lot, and when concrete hits moisture and it freezes, it expands, it spalls. Water creates so many problems. Water is probably the number one damaging material on the planet, like when it comes right down to it. So it's just overlooked a lot, and I often will bring it up. And, there's only so much I can do. You can lead the horse to water, right? And so I'll bring it up. I mean, this should be addressed, and they fluff it off, and only to have it circle back and become a problem later, right?
Right.
And
I've worked with a distributor, and I have no idea the accuracy of this banner, but I loved what it said. It said that the normal construction budget for a new, like high-rise building, 2% of it's waterproofing, whereas 98% of litigation is water intrusion. So, I had no idea on the percentages there, but.
It's probably not too far off, because, water is a damaging substance when it gets in and starts working its way through, and no coatings, despite the claims that manufacturers make about, well, our coating will withstand hydrostatic pressure, our coating will stand backside pressure. No, it won't. Not long term. The only way to solve it might in the beginning, until you drive away, and maybe even until you cash the check, perhaps. But it will be a problem at some point, and the only way to successfully do these things is by stopping the water from getting in. Don't let it get in the first place, and then it won't be a problem. So that's why we line the insides to protect the surface. So we have to figure out some way to keep the moisture out. So grouting is and in a lot of cases, if you're talking about underground things and things of that nature, there's so many cool tricks that you've taught me, and you grout geeks have taught the coating geeks that can be done without as much invasive sort of digging and prodding around and ripping this out and putting this in, and you can do so much of it simply by knowing where to start and drilling holes and pumping grout in. So, I mean, I learned a lot from you actually about it, a ton. And so, yeah, it's one of those things that comes up all the time, but it's mostly ignorance and just, partially ignorance, partially indifference, and then just afterthought.
Right. And I think a lot of it also comes down to you have GCs, and they're focused, on their Gantt charts and how to move this multi-million-dollar project along. And then you're talking about a small percentage of it, or it's not even a percent. It's a problem that's come up. And so they don't realize the long-term effects of just skipping over that or whatever, because they're focused on what the fire is at that time right there. So a lot of times when we're brought in, we're dealing with people that now are closing out a project or trying to finish it up, going, oh, well, I heard months ago this was going to bite me in the butt, and here it is now. I can't get my paycheck because we're still leaking on this tank or whatnot.
Right. And probably one of the places that it's understood the most and it's used a lot in this way, is the underground. So in the sewer manhole restoration, I mean, most of the people that are playing in that game now at least understand the whole inflow and infiltration and what it does to the system and how it, wreaks havoc on the plant and their capacity levels. And, I shouldn't say everybody, but I mean, anybody who's in the business has seen the classic, manhole eruption and I was in actually a few years ago, I was down in Louisiana in New Orleans for a conference. I can't remember whether it was WEFTEC or SSPC or something. And we just outside our hotel, and a huge rain event happened, and you could hear the manhole lids dancing on all around the streets. You could hear it, right? You could hear it, and people are going, "What is that?" I'm going, "Oh, just watch." And soon, but within probably 5-6 minutes, all of a sudden the manholes were coming off the lid, and they're heavy. It takes if you've never lifted one up, they're heavy, and these things just came out, and the water was spewing, and that, when people see that, they kind of understand it, but it's understood a little bit more in that market. Where I find that there's a lack of understanding of it is in the wastewater treatment plant itself, because there's all kinds of problems in water treatment and wastewater treatment with leakage. And with cracks and just, I've been in plants and walking through them, and there's just water dripping everywhere. And like, is that a problem? And they're like, oh yeah, it's been doing that for years. They just walk by it because it's always been there and they've never dealt with it. And a lot of times go, well, there's a solution for that. And they're like, oh really? You know how to fix that? We've tried everything. We've put hydraulic cement in. We've tried to plug it with silicone. They've tried everything. I said, yeah, there's actually a fairly simple way to fix it.
And that ties right in. I mean, I train, it's in my PowerPoint's last line, when to use polyurethanes. When everything else has failed, that's usually a polyurethane, chemical grout job. It's some weird application like that. But yeah, I want to, there's something I always say, and I want to run it by you because you probably have, you could verify or tell me if I'm wrong on this, but when you look at potable water tanks, those things are typically like 3 foot thick, and they're chock full of rebar. I mean, they're just stuffed full of rebar. So any type of drilling crack injection on them is just nightmarish. So a lot of people don't like to do that. And normally what you get when those things leak, you just have a hairline crack because you have so much concrete in there. So what I see, and I don't know how often, but what I imagine happens a lot of times, so you have people just come with hydraulic cement, they rub that out. But you still then have 3 foot of concrete with water all the way through it, and all that reinforcing steel potentially rusting. And you mentioned freeze-thaw effect. That's about 12 times expansion when water freezes. But when you look at corrosion, NACE has put out that it's about 7 or 8 times expansion when the steel rusts. So not as dramatic as freeze-thaw, but still, I mean, 6 times is going to blow up the concrete.
Well, you got to remember that rebar will like if you have rebar, it will expand about 7 times itself, right? But you remember the tensile strength of concrete is very weak. Concrete does not hold itself together very well. It doesn't take much to start to get that expansion happening and to make the problem worse. So you have to keep the moisture out as much as possible. And I mean, the thing with potable water, especially concrete potable water tanks, ground storage tanks, is that if you want to become very unpopular, and I can speak to this because I've done it. If you want to go into an AWWA like D110 concrete, pre-stressed concrete tank committee and mention protective coatings, they want to string you up because it's they want to sell it as maintenance free and you don't need to line it because concrete and truly they don't need to line it, except for when you start get some deterioration and then you get water in, and once water gets in, and then that whole deterioration is expedited. Right, where so you got to keep the moisture out, and you want to keep it away from the rebar. And sometimes we see, for instance, in wastewater, when you're talking about potable water tanks, they're engineered and built and everything. But and precast a lot of them. But when you get into wastewater treatment plants, where you'll find a lot of times mistakes are made and the rebar is too close to the surface, right? And then any water that gets in is going to create that issue much quicker, because that rebar is going to get more moisture. It's going to expand and quicker and cause more damage. So I think that where you see more need for grouting in the potable water world is more to do with treatment plants again, right? Because a lot of these treatment plants are getting long in the tooth. Their concrete has a 50-year design life, and a lot of our stuff is there, right? A lot of stuff has reached that life, and we have no money to replace it. I mean, we barely have money to fix it, right? So I think grouting is on both sides. I mean, obviously you have to have NSF approved grouts and whatnot, but yeah, they play a role in both wastewater and water. But certainly on rebar, you're correct. You got to stop that moisture.
Yeah. So then that's super in depth. And you threw out some terminology that I had no idea, or some acronyms that I don't know what they were, but it reminded me. Question I wanted to ask you is, you have a bunch of acronyms after your name. You're MCI, PCS, ACS.
Yes.
What are all those?
Well, PCS is Protective Coating Specialist.
Okay.
MCI is Master Coating Inspector.
There you go.
And that just means that I have level 3 from both NACE and SSPC.
Okay.
And I have a concrete coating inspector level 2, and I have all the different credentials, and they just call you a master coating inspector. And then ACS is actually an architectural coating specialist.
Okay.
And there's, I cut it off at that. I've got a bunch of different certs and stuff, but there seems to be the ones that people care about the most.
Gotcha. Excellent. That's it. So thank you for educating me on that. Now, what would you say is maybe the most interesting job that you've been on, or unique or weird, or something that just stands out in your head with grouting, obviously?
Well, I mean, I should have been more prepared for that question, and because I've been on so many projects. But one of the things that struck me is a few years ago, I was at a water treatment plant in New Jersey, and I was in the pipe gallery. And you got to remember, the pipe gallery, you have tanks on either side of you, possibly tanks above you, all filled with water, none of which are lined, right? They're all just bare concrete. And I'm walking through this because we're there to look at the pipe, right? Because they've got all this corroding pipe, and they're kind of perplexed. Like, these pipes are severely corroding, and we got all these issues. And I'm walking through this huge pipe gallery, like it's huge, it's long and wide, and they're worried about their pipe. And meanwhile, there's water spraying and dripping and coming out of every pipe penetration and cracks, and I'm going, well, I get that you're, it's like a rainforest in there, basically. Okay. Have you ever been to Niagara Falls and been behind the falls?
I have. My wife has, but
yeah, you can go behind the falls. It's kind of like that, right? And there's water coming out from everywhere, and I'm like, we can address the corrosion and take it off and repair it and do all that stuff, but you got to fix this leaks. And they looked at me like, well, it's a water treatment plant. I go, yeah, but this doesn't have to happen, right? This is not normal. This is not, just part of the normal day that you just let water spew in and all over the place and expect to have good results. So, I made a recommendation, and actually at that time, I recommended Avanti because I think you were still there at that time.
Yep.
And so, and I think they actually addressed all of that in there. But yeah, it was just how oblivious to it they were. And it was like, it was just, there was so much water coming in. And then there was another situation here in Canada at a plant north of here that, you know, they had another situation where they have a tank on one side and a pipe gallery on the other. Now, in the New Jersey one, the pipe gallery wasn't painted. The walls weren't painted. It was just a concrete room. In this one, they kind of wanted to dress it up and make it. So they kept painting these walls. And every time they'd paint the walls, I mean, all these leaks were happening and the paint would come off. And they must have put like 40 coats of paint on this thing. And then I walked in one day and I said, you know, because the paint was now at this point all peeling and they're going, yeah, this is always a problem. I go, well, it's not the paint that's the problem. It's the fact that you got all this water coming out all over the place. And they go, well, we've tried to stop, but we don't know how to do it. And so I gave them some instruction on how to do it. They got somebody, and I don't know who, and I don't even know what product they used. And they fixed it. And since, and I've talked to them since, and they haven't had any issues since. So, you know, it's just that, like I said, it's the lack of education that there's a fix out there. And if, let's be honest, it's not rocket science. It's relatively simple fix, right?
It is. It's just, again, it's non-intuitive. You know, you have a fine crack and you're having trouble getting grout into it, and people crank up the pressure on their pump and they split the concrete, and now you've got extra cracks. You've just made more cracks in there and stuff. So it's just one of those things. A lot of times I truly feel my job is just to give people a warm fuzzy, just to stand behind them and go, no, it's going to be okay. We're just going to watch it for a little bit, and you know, just slow down. It's going to be right. You know, just slowing people down and getting to focus on it, because it's definitely, it's not, most of the grouting jobs aren't very difficult. The hardest things is earnestly figuring out where to put the grout and getting it to that exact location. You only have to do two things to get grouting to work: get the grout to the right location, keep it there long enough, go off. Potable water tanks, it's super hard to get it to that location. Sometimes in manholes, you have high flows, and you got to figure out, well, how I'm going to keep my grout there so it doesn't get washed away. But you solve those two things, you're the champion at that point.
Well, it's funny, and that brings up another memory of a job that we were working on together, and at one point, and they had these structures, and there was a ton of I mean, it was bad, and so the contractor got the grout that we had recommended, and after I found out how much grout they had pumped into this, like an enormous amount of grout, and it wasn't fixing the problem. So I know that somewhere, and this was down in Baltimore, somewhere out in the ocean or in the Chesapeake Bay or somewhere, there's a huge grout island floating around. There could be people living on that one at this point. Right. It was a lot of grout that they pumped out there with nothing to show for it. So it ended up somewhere.
Yep.
Right. It went somewhere, and I'm not sure where, but yeah. So understanding the process of when to stop, yep, and circle back and try a different tactic, as opposed to just keep pumping and pumping and pumping and pumping and pumping is, I mean, there's obviously some big voids that need to be filled, but at some point you have to say, okay, that seems excessive.
Yep. and that's when you bring up big voids, urethanes can totally fill big voids. The problem with filling big voids with urethane, it's usually never cost effective. When you have a giant void, use something else. Use the urethane for cutoff, and you'll see this all the time. You'll see specs for like flowable fill. They're putting in around culverts and stuff like that. Just a lightweight cement. The reason that it doesn't work in some places is either your angle or your water flow is moving the flowable fill out before it sets up. But flowable fill is pennies on the dollar compared to urethanes. So where we get called into those is to come in and put like what I like to call the grout donut. We just come in and put a little donut, ring, and we stop the flow, and then they finish it off with the flowable fill. We don't do the 20 miles of pipe with urethane. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So there's a time and place, but I don't know how many thousands of dollars of grout they pumped into this thing but I keep waiting for that grout island to show up on like a Google Earth picture or something from space. I think they can see it from the space station. We just haven't found it yet.
Right. You know, contractors, everybody's always focused on the dollar amounts of stuff. And so when people do stuff like that, this is when I try to train, I always try to hook it back to dollars and say, you know, you can do that, but you're really just sending my daughter to college or something, because you're wasting the product at that point. So I appreciate the tip, but here's the right way. And that's where you get into stage grouting and all that good stuff.
Yes. Yeah. So there is, well, while we say it's not rocket science, it's like anything else. I mean, painting isn't rocket science either, right? But nothing is, except for rocket science, right? But there's a process to everything to do it right. And you don't have to be the smartest guy in the world. You just have to know how to follow the proper steps and do it properly, and when to and when not to, but whenever you do anything wrong, it typically costs you a lot of money,
right?
And with poor results.
Yeah. And one of the things I say, and again, I'll bounce this off you since you're from the coating side, I always compare our grouts to coatings, because coatings, you can see, you can touch them, you can do all kinds of tests. And this is also going to take into the next thing I go is talking about training from manufacturers. But I always say it behooves us to train our contractors well and support them to get the products in correctly, because it's not like a coating. When you're a coating manufacturer, if there's a problem with your coating, you come out there, you do a pull test, you do a spark test, you can check the millage of it. You can, say the surface prep was wrong, and you can say, you know what, you didn't follow the right installation procedures. With grouting, I come out and say the same thing, that the contractor didn't follow the right. But what are we going to do? Cut the wall out? Dig up the whole thing in downtown and show? We can't prove any of that. So it's very important. Grouting gets a black eye when it's not installed right, because we can't test all those things. And I think that's one of the reasons the grouting's always stayed kind of small, is because there's no really great engineering, quantifiable, repeatable tests that work everywhere to test grouting.
No, it really comes down to, did the water stop?
Yes.
Right. And if the water doesn't stop, that doesn't necessarily mean that there was something wrong with the grout. It's just either the problem was bigger than you thought, because you can't see it.
Yep.
Right. You're doing educated guesses. Right. Yeah. As a grout geek, well, I've seen this before. I know that we're going to have to put a port here and we're going to chase it around here. And, you can make some educated guesses, but you're right. There's no, like, I can go in with the coating and with my gauges and test a DFT and quickly say, well, the spec said you're supposed to have 40 mils on here. You got 20. So you're half of what you should be. Shame on you. Or I can pull the coating off and say, well, you have no surface profile. You didn't prepare it. You're right. But with grouting, it's sort of like, and I'm sure, the skeptics are like, oh yeah, well, you're just saying that to, cover your own butt or whatever. You can't, it's virtually unprovable, other than, well, you didn't stop the water, so it's obviously not working. And they say, well, your grout's no good. Well, right. I do a lot of failure investigations. That's the majority of what I do now is failure analysis. And I like that. It's kind of like CSI paint, and I enjoy that. But still to this day, how many 100 years into this coding thing, and still the biggest cause of failures are poor application, poor surface preparation, poor environmental conditions during the application. It's always relates, like 98% of the time, it relates back to something that didn't go right with the application. And that can be the same with grouting, right? If you don't know how the water's flowing, or can make some educated guesses of how the water's getting in, you don't know where to start. And sometimes, as you could be pumping grout in one side and it's coming out the other side, and not doing anything, right?
It always goes somewhere. It's
yes.
How do we get it to go where we want it to on the other, a foot through a foot of concrete? How do we control a liquid? You know, I mean, that's what it comes down to. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I get that it's difficult sometimes, but to me, it's a very simple way to address one of those common problems that we have, and that's basically water being where we don't want it to be.
Right. Yes. And it's, well, I mean, there's a reason we have the Grand Canyon. You give water enough time, it's going to make channels and get its way. And our concrete, you brought it up earlier, typically 50-year lifespan, but we know we have concrete structures that are hundreds of years old, that are still, quote, in service and working. So it's water is just super powerful, as we've discussed, and will make its way.
Well, in truth is, I mean, I've been in plants that were built in the 20s, for instance, and the concrete is still spectacular. And then I've been in plants that were built in the 90s where it's falling apart. And right. that comes right back to the quality of the material. Obviously the stuff that they placed and created and placed in 1920 was a really good product. And the stuff that I found in 1990 was subpar. It wasn't right. as good a product. And I think that's where, you're going to, there's been a sort of a uptick in things like grouting and whatnot, because when you have substandard original material, it's got more flaws in it, and that's where polyurethane grouting can save people a lot of headaches and time with these substrates that are less than ideal.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, typically grouting goes on for two reasons. One, something got old and is now leaking, and it's just a lot better than digging everything up, or you can't even dig it up or access it, so you grout it. Or two, someone screwed it up when they put it in. So
it's right.
Kind of the two grout, and that's the emergency grouting when they call you up and say, "Hey, can you be here tomorrow with a pallet of grout?"
Yeah.
So, but I want to go over. Obviously, I'm director of technical services. I've been on the services side for close to 18 years, pretty much now. So I'm a big proponent of training and providing service. One of the few companies that I've seen, or other manufacturers that I've seen that are real big, that I've had involved with, I'm not saying it doesn't exist out there, there's tons, but is Sherwin-Williams seems like a champion of educating. They've got a great technical service group, it seems like. I wanted to get your opinion on the value and basically helping to bring contractors, to the trough, to drink, to understand, to learn things like that.
Yeah.
I don't even know if that was a question, more of a statement, but.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things I think that was unique somewhat to our group at Sherwin-Williams. I mean, Kevin Morris and myself saw Sherwin-Williams is a sales organization. Okay. They manufacture paint to sell it. They aren't necessarily a technical organization. That comes as part of the whole manufacturing and selling. You got to have technical people. But I always believe that the more educated the reps are that are out there selling it, the more they're going to be able to sell. Because if you don't know as much about something as the person you're trying to sell it to, you're going to have very limited results. But if you can at least talk the talk and walk the walk and understand what you're talking about and what you're selling, then you're going to be more successful, and you're going to be able to help out your customers, which builds customer loyalty. If you solve a problem for somebody, I mean, they don't readily forget you. Especially, that's how I built my whole career as a rep, was help people out, solve problems for them, and they will always come back for more. Always. Right. It's very rarely that you save somebody some money and get them out of a jam that they go, well, I'm going to lose his number. Right. That's not the way it works. So I think that Kevin and I decided early on when during with our relationship, how could we make it better? How can we make our people smarter and more equipped to sell? And it's a whole package, because you're selling coatings, but we know the number one enemy of coatings is water. And so they sort of go hand in hand. So I think that, you know, running these training sessions, and yes, it was for contractors too. We brought contractors in, but I almost seen that was great and everything, but I saw educating our own people is more important than even educating the contractor. You know,
Right.
I to be able to then go out and help these guys, because so I thought they were very successful, the training sessions we did. And I think that, you know, if you're going to be a sales organization and you don't take, and this has been a pet peeve of mine with every sales organization I've worked with in the paint world, you can't just find another one, right? It's not like selling shoes or widgets. You know, there's a technical aspect to coating sales, especially on the industrial side. And, you know, the more educated and that you can make your salespeople, the better they're going to be. And you're also reducing your own risk at the same time by doing things right. We just talked about what causes most failures is ignorance, indifference. It's the same reason that they don't use grout. It's the same reason things fail. Indifference to quality, ignorance to quality. A lot of people, like my old man was classic. He thought he did good work, right? He just thought everybody was too fussy, right? It'll be fine, you know? And I was that young guy who was like, no, I don't think that's right, Dad. I think that's a horrible plan, you know? And he used to tell me all the time, you know, because he never used his blinkers. I may have told you this story before. My dad never used his blinkers, and it used to infuriate me. And I'd say, you know, in the car, I'd say, Dad, I said, you got to use your blinkers, man. You have to be, listen to me, smart guy. I've been driving for 50 years or whatever it was, and I've never had an accident. So, and I go, yeah, well, you've left a trail of destruction behind you. You just don't know what you don't know. And that's kind of like contractors, right? They think they're doing good, but they don't realize that what they're missing is creating a whole backlog of problems. And you know, so I think all this training that needs to happen with the coating manufacturers. I mean, what could you possibly lose by being smarter about products, right?
Yeah.
Why not? I mean, we send as sales organizations, and I can speak candidly about that now because I don't work for them anymore. But you know, we spend so much time on sending people for this training and that training, or this, you know, feel good training and all this stuff that doesn't move the needle at all. It's just as somebody can check off a box and say, yeah, we accomplished that. And it was always more difficult when we tried to push them through to real technical training. Because it's not, you don't do it in an afternoon, right? We used to run our boot camps, if you remember, and they were intense kind of weeks of training and getting things in people's hands and getting a grout gun in their hand and, you know, hooking that nozzle up to the Zerk and pumping it, you know, run it, you know, that kind of stuff is that hands-on. That's how I learn.
Yep.
I learn by doing, right? And so I think the more that you can convince these coating manufacturers to accept this training and to invest in it will be, because I mean, if you think about it, we know that the biggest opportunity in waterproofing and grouting we haven't even scratched the surface of it yet. Right? We're dealing with things, the obvious, but there's the stuff that's not obvious that it can fix. That is the biggest opportunity.
Right. And boy, there was a lot there. That was great. I mean, the insight about the training and how you guys set that up for wastewater at Sherman was spectacular. You hitting on, oh God, I don't even know where to start with all the different things you covered there. But I guess really what it comes down to, I've just totally lost my train of thought, is what it comes down to. So this is the Injection Connection. I'm not a professional podcaster, so I apologize, everybody. I'm going to start quoting you, saying, you know, the number one, if I can remember the quote now, the number one problem for coatings is the water infiltration. I think you said something like that, or you said it's a major issue.
Yeah, on concrete, I mean,
Yeah.
if you don't control where the water's going, it's going to control what you do. We're trying to keep, like I said, we're trying to keep water out of concrete from both sides,
Right.
right? From the tank side and from the ground side. We got to try to keep that water out. And the smartest way to do that. And it's funny because every project you work on and you go, well, is there a vapor barrier here? Well, I don't know. They don't know.
No.
They don't know. The record keeping was suspicious at best. Nobody knows. So and I'm not a big fan of putting linings over and warranties on things that I don't know what's going to happen to them from the backside. And I can tell you that the fix for that is more expensive on the other side. Like if I try to do it on the positive side of the tank, where the water is, it's an expensive process to try and address water there. It's much better to address it on the other side.
Right.
Right. And grout's not cheap. What is cheap? I mean, what is worth, it's always a chain reaction. It's always a chain reaction. And you never think it's like, well, we're going to eliminate inspection on this job because we don't really have the money for it. Well, what about when it fails? You're going to have the money to fix it?
Right.
Well, yeah, we'll find the money then. Well, why don't you find it now and save yourself all this aggravation later? Right.
Yeah.
And it's the same with grout. Why don't you find the money now to do this right and stop the water rather than, here, we'll flip the coin and hope that what comes out the other end fine. Because whenever something goes wrong, it's really expensive to fix.
It is indeed. And one of the things I find going back with this training of contractors, when you have companies out there, they're coatings companies. There's tons of companies. That's what they do. They install coatings all the time. You don't really have a grouting company out there that all the time they're doing a specific type of waterproof grouting. I mean, there are some that do, I guess, relatively consistent, but the majority, I would say, I don't know, 65 to 70% of the customers, they grout 4 or 5 times a year or less than that. And so grouting, learning it, even just having a class with them and training stuff, it's like a language. If I gave you 4 Spanish classes, or I guess for you up there, can you speak French?
No.
Okay, see, you're in Canada though. But
yeah.
So if I gave you a 4 times a year, I gave you a class on French, I bet 3 years from now when we went back on it, you'd be able to say a few words, but you would not be fluent or anything like that. And that's the same thing with the grouting training that I do a lot of times. So I've changed. When I first started, I was like, I got really down in the minutia and went, right to the heart, surgical strike on stuff. Now I do a giant overview, get big concepts, have key concepts, and set out the alert to people. That's what I try to do, because I know they're not going to remember the whole thing, So a lot of my training now is focused on, these are red flags, but the beginning and end of my training always starts with, just remember, if it sounds like a grouting opportunity, give us a call. Let us help you select. When you start looking at our tech data sheets, and we have all these different grouts, and they all look about the same on the tech data sheet, you're not going to know. And then the problem is that you're going to call me later with, well, it's not working. And the most embarrassing thing that happens at that point, not just embarrassing, costly, is when I come in and you've already pumped 40 gallons of grout, and I come in with 2 gallons of grout and solve your problem because I selected the right application and the right grout. And then your boss asks, well, what was that other 50 gallons for, and why the hell did we do that?
Yeah.
And so if I have that conversation beforehand, it's all great and everybody looks great. When you have that afterwards, it's embarrassing.
Well, it also comes down to information in, right? Like I learned this from you early on, is that, like, water temperature. There's so much that makes a difference in how quickly that grout sets off. And you have the ability to manipulate the grout to do what you want it to do if you know what you're up against.
Yeah.
right? If you know the scenarios, and it's not good enough to go, well, I got a leak, come and fix it. Oh, well, there's a whole bunch more I need to know than that, right? Than just, to be able to be effective. And I think that's a good plan. I mean, you can't, unfortunately, you're right. If people are doing this 2 or 3 times a year, or maybe it's twice every 2 years because they just ran into a project that needed it, but then they didn't need it for like 2 more years, another project showed up, they're not going to remember any of that stuff. I mean, I can speak for myself. I mean, I can't, I can retain the basics of it, but it's the little intricacies. So I think your idea of training them to understand, it's almost like training them to understand what they don't know, and
Yes.
and that there's a solution for it. Here's the number, call and we'll help you walk you through it, because you can do it. It's just you're going to need a refresher to be able to figure it out.
That's exactly, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
And what I've found in the industry when I'm training people that have never done grouting before, the ones that I find that are the easiest, honestly, are people who do coatings. The reason being is because, first off, coatings, it's methodical, but they're also already handling paint equipment and chemicals. So because when you talk to some contractors, like, oh my God, I got to buy an airless paint sprayer, and that's a giant. Can't I just use a caulk gun or something? And when you're starting off at that level, you're like, you can, but it's like showing up to do brain surgery, and you've got a drill and a hammer, and a kitchen knife. It's not the right way to start off. So yeah, coating guys, we did a webinar with just all internal Sherwin-Williams people, and there was like 50 people on there, and we got a number of good opportunities out of that. But one of the best ones was a flooring guy. He just happened to be on there. One of your flooring guys, he got one of his coating guys who is now a regular grout user. And it's not, they don't go chase the jobs. They don't go looking. They just do it all internally. When they run into a situation, they go, this is going to be a problem for our coating. We know it. We're going to go ahead and grout that ourselves beforehand. And that to me is wonderful.
One of the biggest problems with floring's a nightmare. Like, there's a lot of coating failures on floors, and a lot of it has to do with moisture.
Yep.
Right. Because where's that moisture traveling from? The underneath the slab? It's coming through. It's chasing the heat, right? It's coming up through, and anything you put over top of it, if you don't address it, is coming off. Like, it just, it's blistering and causing issues. So yeah, I see that's one of the things that, was top of mind for me. It wasn't my division. It wasn't sort of my responsibility, but I always thought the flooring people need to know about this.
Yeah.
Right.
So.
Because grouting, water is a big problem for them.
Well, we've been talking a bit here, Maria. I really want to thank you for your time. And honestly, I hate pinching this off, but because, just picking your brain is spectacular. But Murray's a busy guy. He's one of the few people that I know that travels more than I do. He also covers the North American territory, which is it's a huge area. And so, we're always on the road. But Murray, thank you very much for your time, and appreciate it.
I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk to you about it. Thanks for thinking of me. I hope I said some things some intelligent things that you could feel edit at will. Cut out my long ranting, rambling.
No. If we edit anything, it's my flub where I just couldn't even come up with any words there. So it's wonderful to touch base with you again, Murray.
Well, great. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Much success with your podcast. I hope you get lots of people tuning in.
Well, thank you. And I know you've been at SPC for about a year now? SCP? Oh my God.
CPI.
CPI. Oh gosh. Sorry about that. We're going to edit that one.
Yeah. Since November of 2021.
There you go.
Yeah, it was a bit delayed because I kind of got plowed over by a car there, and so I had a bit of a slow start, if you will, while I healed up. But I'm hitting the ground running now.
And this just attests to how wonderful a person Murray is. He says this all with a smile. He got a hip and new pelvis and all kinds of stuff. Just went through it. What, like 5 weeks later, you're out golfing again?
Yeah, about that.
That's it. So, I mean, we talk about getting up and just taking care of stuff and getting back at it in a foreign country. Oh my God. So very just amazing. I'm sorry you had to go through that, but it's wonderful when you can smile about it and you know, you've kind of, you know.
Well, I had them I asked them to put a grease nipple in just to keep it. They wouldn't do it, but I wanted them to put a grease nipple in, kind of like a Zerk.
We can grout you.
Yeah,
then.
exactly. Exactly.
All right. Well, on that note, so now that we're into medical grouting, we'll go ahead and end this podcast. And maybe that'll be the next one we start. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks.
All right. So excellent. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well, I hope it was what you were expecting.
It was more so. So no, yeah. I mean, this is one of it had a life of its own and kept rolling. So I had to cut it off somewhere, but no, I appreciate it.
Well, I hope they one day, because I'm thinking of a bunch of different angles. I'm back shooting some rants and whatnot again, and you know, I want to do sort of a few other things similar to what you're doing, and from a coding perspective, and so one day, hopefully, I will have you join me on a podcast.
Excellent. I love it.
Yeah.
Awesome. So
absolutely.
Well, cool. You have a good one. I'm gonna get back at it here.
All right. Thanks, Charlie.
Catch you later.